All right, fans, my guest at this time is the very controversial host.
Get the hell out of here. Let me tell you something, Mean Gene. I thought I knew who my friends were. I thought, hey, those guys that I've joined on the podcast, they're never gonna leave me. They're always gonna have me there. And then I find out, for no reason at all, they're interviewing Charles Cecil, and I'm not there. Let me tell you something, Mean Gene, that hurts. That hurts me real bad. So I'm leaving the podcast. I'm gonna try and be a co-host on Blue Cup Tools. They look like they could do with another host. And if that doesn't work, I'm gonna kill off Joe Mastriani, and I'm gonna be on the Upper Memory Block podcast. And I'm gonna make that great. And if that doesn't work, then maybe I'll be back next week. Please enjoy this interview with Charles Cecil.
Hello, and welcome to Backseat Designers Season V episode. No, we don't do episode numbers this season. Today is a very special day for two reasons. One is that I am, of course, joined by my good friend Frederick Olsen. Say hello, sir.
Hello. There are two lies in that sentence.
And the special reason is that we do not have Sir Gareth Millwood, knighted by the University of wherever the fuck.
Playing very, very loose with the titles now.
Yes, I am. Professor Gareth is sadly unable to join us today because apparently he has a life outside of this podcast. I didn't know that. Who knew that? But sadly, we will have to live without his calming British tones and his soundboard and all of that. But that brings me to my second interesting point of specialness, which is that we have a guest on the show who will rise to the occasion and dethrone Gareth of his Britishness. Sorry, finish that sentence for me.
This is all very, very dramatic. I think we're gonna put the Game of Thrones music underneath it once we edit it.
Oh yeah, copyright be damned. Yes, what we do have is a very special person whom we are very excited to welcome to the show because we have tried to get him on the show for a little over 2 years, I think, and it's finally happened. So welcome, Mr. Charles Cecil.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes, welcome.
I mean, what a great introduction. I'm not sure that I can really step in for the great Gareth. I think those shoes are probably too big for certainly me and probably many others to fill.
Yes, he wears phenomenally large shoes.
He's only a size 8 or something.
Shh. We wouldn't talk about that.
I was going to say, because you know what they say about people with large feet.
Yes.
I wear about the equivalent of size 12, and unfortunately it is not true.
Well, it's not true that you don't have large socks.
Oh yeah, that part is true.
Yes. Which is, of course, what we were referring to.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, got confused there for a minute.
Well, that is off to a fantastic start.
Splendid.
Yes.
I think you'll be able to fill Gareth's shoes and other clothing just fine, basically.
Right. Yes. Well, I shall look forward to stepping up to the challenge.
Ah, yes. We have an exciting hour ahead for you, sir. We shall probe your fantastic mind with questions that even Gareth, with his PhD in whatever the hellness, would be unable to answer. Absolutely.
I shall look forward to it.
What we are actually doing here is sort of carrying on the trend of asking people who have actually accomplished things in their lives about what is the state of the adventure game industry. Now, we've had this chat with Dave Gilbert of Wadget Eye. We've had it with Sean Mills of Infamous Quests, Katie Hallahan from Phoenix Online, and now we're having it with Mr. Cecil. The difference, of course, being that the three previously mentioned people are, well, in comparison at least, relative newcomers onto the industry scene, whereas Mr. Cecil is what we would like to affectionately call a veteran.
Steady on.
Yes.
Not only are they newcomers, but they're also indies. I mean, that I think is the interesting bit. And Troels mentioned this before we started. You've been in the game for quite a while with the same company.
Yeah, no, but we're still very indie. I mean, it might not look at it from outside, but we are. We have a very small team.
Well, there's that. You managed to stay small. I've read about the humble beginnings of the fruit shop on the second floor of the second floor of a fruit shop. There goes my ground.
It was on the second floor, yeah. So as I said, I actually started writing games in 1981 when I was just about to go to university, or just started university. And that was for the Sinclair ZX81, which had 1 whole K of memory, and had the privilege of getting involved with the industry right at the very beginning, with a company called Arctic Computing, which was based in Hull, which is where my relationship with Hull and indeed Yorkshire comes from. Mm-hmm. And that was with a fellow who I met at Ford. We were both sponsored. We were management trainees in engineering, and decided that actually video games sounded a lot more fun. At that particular time, the car industry in the UK was in a terrible state. I mean, really dire. We were producing, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, we produced the most amazing cars and exported them around the world. And somehow the whole thing collapsed, so that by the 70s and the early 80s, we were producing terrible products. And the government decided that to step in, they were going to set up these very intensive schemes to train young graduates. And I was privileged to be part of that. And I met a friend whose parents had offered him either a party for his 18th birthday or a Sinclair ZX81. And
go with the antisocial choice.
I was going to say, thankfully for me and for him, and he went for the ZX81, and he invited me up to see his little company, which was based in his house, his parents' house, in his bedroom. He was truly a bedroom coder, and it was just fantastic. And he said, "Well, why don't you write me a game?" And so I did, and that was it. Back in those days, 35, 36, 37 years ago. Wow. Oh my God, that's terrifying.
That is fantastic.
But I love the nonchalant way that people who have been in the business for so long talk about this. So I just coded my first game, and that was it. Nothing in particular to it. You mentioned before we started the show that it was an adventure game that you made. What kind of story did you come up with in those days?
I'm not proud, because I've just been to see Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is such a brilliant film, and it's just lasted so well. And there was an era, wasn't there, where these films like Alien as well. I think Alien is a masterpiece.
Absolutely.
And apart from Sigourney Weaver's hairstyle, which we'll forgive her for, it has aged extraordinarily well, and it could easily be made, just as easily be made now as back in the late 70s.
There was a golden age of blockbusters where these movies were genius, and there was no real internet around, so you wouldn't really have to deal with spoilers or stupid fan theories. Who is Supreme Leader Snoke anyway? That kind of stuff.
It was an amazing time, back when blockbusters didn't suck as bad.
Well, it's kind of, you look at the films, the blockbusters now, and if you consider the very few films that we had that were really special, it's very easy to look back through rose-tinted glasses. But I'd also say that when you had films like the Usual Suspects that came out at about the same time, very, very close to Pulp Fiction. Mm-hmm. Again, you were talking about interesting, amazing films. I think in many ways, a lot of television now is very special. Though, if you look at, I know it's quite old, but you look at some of the television series that came out from HBO.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And they're terrific. So I think there's a lot of good stuff going on, but there are and there are some very moving films. I mean, we had some very good ones this year in the UK. I mean, really terrific films, but it's the blockbusters that generally I think are disappointing because there's this sort of obsession with on special effects.
Right, and it's all Marvel, and it's all connected, and you have to watch every single one, and they put out about 50 a year, and apart from the Star Wars trilogy films, there are also going to be in-between films, so, more money out of your pocket. It's a bit of a saturated market, if you ask me. I don't believe focus is on the stories anymore.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's in television. Binge watching episodes, coming out on Netflix, you got 8 or 10 or 12 episodes to just binge watch through, and you wake up and all of a sudden it's 4 a.m. and you've just sat through an entire TV series. Yep. And it gives them the chance to tell expansive and cohesive stories with lots of character development that you can't get through in a 2-hour popcorn movie. So, boy, that's great.
Well, I think that the first one that really came to our attention, my attention, was Breaking Bad, which was just so good. And the way that the writers had to approach the telling of a story, as you say, is so different to the way that a writer would tell a story in a film that might be 2 hours or an hour and 3/4. And clearly what you've got to do is build attention, because I think most people probably do binge watch, unless they're watching avidly. And I think that I have a very high regard for these writers, because clearly they're able to grab their audience and bring them back each time, whether they watch on a weekly basis or whether they binge watch. Very talented people.
So, well, the entire impetus for all of this interesting discussion was, what was your first game about? So I'm guessing that
he's trying to stall it.
Yeah, I think
I really hope we've forgotten by now.
We just went up this nice slope of yes, all the writers, they're getting so brilliant, character development, it's all going to be so good. Incidentally, my first game was about tying an Indian woman to a cactus. No, that wasn't it.
Thankfully, it wasn't about
that. Was not you.
To a cactus. No, that was nothing to do with me. But there was a game that involved tying an Indian woman to a cactus.
Yes.
Which was that?
I was just trying to come up with the most abysmal example I could, and I'm sorry if I.
No, there is one. I think it's like an Atari. It's really strange and very sexist.
Custer's Revenge.
Yes, exactly.
Custer's Revenge. That's the one. I'm delighted to say that I had absolutely nothing to do with Custer's Revenge.
Well, applause on that. Yes, it is one of the most abysmal titles to ever come out of the video game industry, bar none.
I think anyone who were ever in doubt whether you had any involvement with that are going to be relieved now.
I was absolutely joking.
It wasn't that.
Please believe me.
It wasn't that broken sword you were involved with. Never mind.
I just took a sip of water, you fuck. You almost spat all over my microphone on that one. Okay, thank you. So have we stalled enough?
I think I've tried to lead you off, but clearly you're not being led, so I'm going to have to answer the question directly. It does actually go back to Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark, because my first game was called Adventure B, Inca Curse, and it was very much inspired by the imagery of Indiana Jones going into that extraordinary opening scene when he goes into the cave and he grabs the stone.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, the statue, the head, the statue. The interesting thing is that I had no idea what to write, and it started, you are in a jungle clearing, and it's not very good, and the spelling is terrible. I mean, really terrible.
That's a sales pitch, if ever I heard one.
Well, I know. And it was quite sweet, because back in those days, we actually met our audience, our fans, at what were called microfairs. And I remember this young man sidling up to me and saying, I managed to convince the wife that I should buy this ZX81 because it would be good for our son's homework. And I went, oh yes. And you give each other the knowing wink, which is they bought it for the homework.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And he said, but the problem is that she was watching us play, and chisel is spelt with an S, not a Z. And can't really should have an apostrophe between the N and the T. And he went on and on and on. And he said, honestly, she doesn't believe a word I say because your spelling is so bad that actually to try and justify this on educational grounds makes no sense whatsoever. But it was very sweet. And and what was interesting is that you went in and you collected treasure and there were traps. It was sort of fairly standard adventure. But there was a trigger point at which, as far as I remember, the big stone comes out. And then you've got three turns to get out. Yeah. So we carefully worked out the maximum that you could carry, which I don't know how many objects, I don't remember. But we worked out what the most valuable pieces of treasure that you could get. And we said, this is your target. But very quickly, people came back and they had worked out that what you could do is you could pile treasure up just before you triggered the stone. And then you could ferry it back in and out. And by doing that, you could get much higher than the score that we thought was possible. And that was fascinating because it was showing that actually people were really interested to subvert the system. They'd play the game again and again, work out what the internal mechanics were, and subvert it.
That is the same thing you do every time you get a brand new toy. I remember getting like a remote controlled little car, and it wasn't actually remote control because the remote control was physically attached to the car itself with a cord. So it was one of those really cheap pieces of shit.
Very, very impractical.
And of course, being a child, I was absolutely convinced that it could turn into an actual real remote control car if I just snipped the cable with scissors. So, yeah, no one was happy about that. But I did learn a valuable lesson. And
I had a pipe dream of being able to access the internet without a modem, which is an infinitely more stupid idea. But I didn't break anything, thank God. Only my own brain.
But I suppose the auspicious starts of Charles Cecil, the game developer, was just going around your friend's house being asked to write a game. Then you did, and then you started selling it. What were publishers' role back in like the early 80s? How did you get this thing in the stores or in people's hands?
Oh, stores. There were no stores.
Exactly.
So the way you got into people's hands is you'd put an advert in the back of the magazines at the time, like PCW, PC World, and very, very naive, and people would buy them. And the company, Arctic Computing, had a good reputation, so people bought. My game was reasonably popular. In fact, I'm quite proud of the fact that if you go to eBay now and you look at the ZX81 and Spectrum games, a large number are the adventures that I wrote. Now, I never got paid anything for them, but that's not the point.
You got paid in exposure.
I got paid in exposure, and also I became a director of the company, and we had fun and we did amazing things. So
that's not bad. Eventually, a salary probably came on the table, I suppose.
No, there was no salary because I was at university. We didn't pay ourselves salaries, but I remember flying off to the East Coast for the West Coast for I think it was the West Coast Computer Fair, which would have been about in 1982. And to think, Steve Jobs would have been wandering around, Wozniak. If only I'd known how extraordinary the industry was going to be, I would have seen these incredible people. It was amazing. It was amazing, and they were all hippies in those days. And they drove those kind of. They were still driving those 50s, those really exaggerated 50s cars. It was fantastic, absolutely fantastic.
Well, now you know sort of how I felt the first time I came to Adventure X, just walking around going, my fucking God, there's Dave Gilbert. And he's much shorter than I am.
And then he turns around and goes, stop following me.
Yes. Well, we since became friends, and the court order has now been rescinded.
Fantastic.
Yes. So I'd hate to fast forward, but you're such a good storyteller. Well, I think other people have said this before to you, but I'll repeat it. You're a very good storyteller, sir.
Bless you.
But we have to keep moving, otherwise we'll have to turn this into a two-parter, and then no games will ever come out of Revolution again.
Okay. So but let me then. So let me build up for Revolution. And so basically, Arctic did really well for a couple of years, and then bigger companies like Activision came along, much better funded, and Arctic just disappeared. And so I set up a little commercial development house, and then I was approached by US Gold, worked for US Gold for a year and a bit, year and a half, 2 years, and then poached by Activision.
Okay, so you were simply on on the fast track. You started out in someone's bedroom, and that was just the career. It just went.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
And at Activision, the US side were pretty. I mean, they were really useless, to be honest. I mean, there were some terrible people there, and they managed to drive the company into the ground. And one day, my boss came to me and said, "Who wasn't? I mean, he was one of the good guys, Jeff Mulligan." And he said, "Look, I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to make you redundant. Would you mind working for Activision for 2 days a week? And you can do whatever you want in the 3 days, but we'll only pay you for 2." But that was brilliant, because I'd got so fed up with development for a publisher. I wanted to set up my own company anyway, and I'd been planning to do so. So this was the perfect opportunity.
More spare time to do it.
Yes, and you're being paid for the other 2 days, so it was ideal. And I'd worked at Arctic. We'd had a game sent in to us called Obsidian by a very young programmer called Tony Warrener, and we published it. And it was a brilliant. I mean, it was a really great game. He designed the characters. I mean, in those days, one person did everything. They'd do the graphics, the music, the programming. They'd QA it. They'd do absolutely everything.
Yes.
And so Tony had drawn the characters in pixels and actually worked out the hexadecimal values to the side. I mean, he was incredibly intricate in the way that he did it. And Tony and I became friends and remained friends. And so we'd been talking about setting up and writing adventures. And there was a tester that was at Activision with me, a fellow called Dave Cummins.
Oh, yeah.
And Dave was such a great writer. And I remember him writing a test report for an adventure game that was sent in. And he'd written it in a way that was so much better than the adventure itself. And Dave was very eclectic. He was a very complex character, troubled in many ways, but a very great writer. And so when we needed a writer and somebody to help me design, I asked Dave if he'd like to come. And he was out of a job when Activision closed down. And I'm delighted to say that he came up to Hull, which is where the company was set up. And became one of the first members of the team.
Mm-hmm. And the reason I went ooh before is because I recognized the name. He pretty much wrote Beneath a Steel Sky, if not single-handedly, then wrote a lot of it.
Well, he wrote an awful lot of it. And a lot of Broken Sword 1.
Yeah, exactly.
And what would happen is that he and I would work together. And the reason that you get this sort of juxtaposition of the silliness and the seriousness is that I was always wanting to write a more serious storyline, and he was always working to subvert it by writing silly dialogue.
Broken Sword has some of the best silly dialogue. I mean, a character like Lady Piermont, who is the queen of innuendo, as far as I see it, that's very, very clearly Dave.
That's absolutely Dave. That's Dave through and through. And I mean, let's give him, a lot of credit, because he was absolutely fantastic. He was a central part of that game development process, and as I say, he was both complex and troubled. So we'll come back as we go through Revolution. We'll talk about him further. But then we needed somebody to do the backgrounds, and somebody sent us a letter from Newcastle, a guy called Adam Twee, and Adam was brilliant. We were looking for somebody else got hold of us. They were working as a clerk for Kalamazoo, doing a really basic job. a fellow called Steve Odes, and he turned out to be the most wonderful animator. So we stumbled on an extraordinary team for our first game, Year of the Temptress, which was Tony Warrener and his former programming partner, Dave Sykes, and Dave Cummins on writing the dialogue and supporting the design with me, and Adam Tweedy doing the backgrounds, and Steve Oates doing the drawing the sprites and animating the sprites. And I often look back and think how lucky we were to find such a talented group of people in a relatively short time.
Well, sometimes the star just aligns. I mean, did you look out the window and just see like a full moon and wolves howling in the background and frogs
carefully
raining from the sky?
Carefully leaving out the sacred ritual.
Yes. I think you neglected to mention the black candles and the chanting, but yeah,
we were very lucky, and I have to say there were some people that went by the wayside who weren't good enough. So we were quite selective about it.
Right.
But we were very lucky. We were very lucky.
And Lure of the Temptress is the first iteration of what you ended up calling the virtual theater system, which I thought was absolutely brilliant the first time I had a look at it, which was that normally you'd expect NPCs to just stand around like glued to the floor, expecting you to bring them shit, and then, making you progress in your quest when you finally bring them shit. But your NPCs actually moved around the game world. They weren't just confined to one space all the time forever. And that was an interesting, and this is around the time when you had big competitors. You had Sierra and LucasArts already, reigning supreme. So for you to come out with something that was uniquely different, or at least a slightly unique take on the adventure game genre was, how was that received at the time?
Well, our publisher was a company called Microsoft.
Yes.
That is very, very close to the point of I can smell a lawsuit from here.
Oh yeah, I seem to recall that name. It involves a boating accident of some kind.
It does.
Yes.
It does. You're much too young to remember that at the time, though.
I watch a lot of retrospective YouTube videos
and have a lot of boat accidents.
Yes, I love boat accidents. They're my favorite.
So the fellow was called Robert Maxwell.
Yes.
And I don't think that I could be done for slander for saying that he was a total crook. But anyway, he was part of the Mirror. The Mirror is one of the big newspapers, left-wing newspapers in the UK, and he owned it. And he set up a company called Mirrorsoft, which was incredibly successful. They had the licenses to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They broke the Bitmap Brothers. They signed us up. I remember talking to the Yves Guillemot and Alan Core, who are wonderful, and they said at the time they couldn't work out how they could possibly succeed against such awesome competition. And then Robert Maxwell fell off his boat, as you say, or was pushed off his boat, or was murdered. It all collapsed, and suddenly everything was out in the open. It was extraordinary. But how was it received is the question that you asked. Mirrorsoft did a press conference, and we launched it. And I remember this was, in fact, sorry, let me go back. A friend called Sean Brennan, industry friend, had, when he heard that Activision was going down, he actually drove, he was the deputy head of Mirrorsoft. He drove to take me out for lunch. And he said, if you wanted to start a studio, we'd be delighted to support you, which was an incredibly generous thing to say. And I had wanted to start a studio, so that gave me the impetus. And we basically decided that we were going to put together this demo showing virtual theatre and present it to him. Mm-hmm. Now, I had a PC, a 386, which was really expensive. It was, I think it had cost nearly £1,000, which, bearing in mind that this is 35 years ago, was an awful lot of money, particularly for somebody who had just had a job as the head of development. And I lent it to Tony and Dave, or I gave it to Tony and Dave to develop the game, and they were above the fruit shop, and they worked really hard. And then just before we were, the afternoon before we were due to present it to Microsoft, they drove down and parked outside the flat, stayed in the flat. Now, because the PC was so valuable, I insisted that they put a blanket around it and strapped it in like a child, just in case they crashed. Well, that's what they did.
I think I see where this is going. You're about to have your own little boating accident, I think.
Well. So they came down and they came and we had a glass of wine and we cooked some dinner and it was great. And we woke up the next morning with a little bit of a hangover, which was a bit silly because we were about to do the presentation. And I looked out of the window and the car had been broken into.
Oh dear.
But guess what we'd left on the back seat because we'd forgotten to bring it in?
The computer?
Computer.
So it had simply just gone missing in the wind, so to speak.
No.
Oh, it was still there under a blanket.
Still there. What they've done is they've taken the radio, they've taken the tapes, they've taken everything.
And
the
then
thing they had taken was the PC on the back seat.
And then they probably just thought, what kind of sick, perverted person would leave a baby out here in the middle of the night?
Exactly.
Or maybe it's just I don't know how automobile robbers work in the UK, but in Denmark they would just look at the blanket and go, I'm not touching that. Who knows what could be under this blanket? So apparently
that's probably exactly what it was. They probably thought there was a pile of porno mags or something, and didn't want to get involved. But anyway, we did we did the presentation. Obviously, Microsoft decided to fund the studio, which was fantastic. And the first time we decided to announce it was at PCW, was it? PCW show? PC World show, I think, was the forerunner to ECTS. And there was a meeting room, and we had about 20 people. And one of them was a guy called Bob Jacobs, who had founded Cinemaware. Do you remember Cinemaware, Defender of the Crown?
Absolutely. The thing with the giant ants, it came from the desert. And
that's one of those. Yes.
Yeah. He was good friends with Dennis Dyack, Silicon Knights, at one point. So apparently the first Silicon Knights games, Steel Empire, or Cyber Empires as it was known in the US, was developed sort of concurrently with Defender of the Crown.
Well, there you go.
Something along those lines. Yeah.
There was a journalist from Japan login.
I just realized I just went nowhere with that story. I was trying to impress you.
I'm very impressed.
This is quite nerve-wracking, isn't it? No, please go on.
And so at the end of it, I finished and I stood there and everybody was silent. And I thought, oh my God, this has gone really badly. And then somebody started clapping, and then everybody started clapping, and they started clapping really enthusiastically. And then somebody stood up, and then everybody stood up. And it was, oh my God, this is just brilliant. This reception is fantastic. And then they formed a queue to come and talk to me. And at the front was Bob Jacobs. And he said, this is great. Can we publish it? Blah, 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 blah. So it was just really, really good. And one of the regrets that I've had over all of that time is that we have not made enough of virtual theatre. I always regretted not doing so. We did use it a bit in Beneath the Steel Sky. So our new game, which obviously we're not talking about, is very much at its heart is the idea of using virtual theatre to its full extent.
Right. Yes, because I remember back in my teenage years, I was sort of knocking at Revolution's door, because Beneath the Steel Sky is my I was going to say second favorite game in the whole world. Sometimes it actually ties up with Space Quest. When people ask me what my favorite game series is, I say Space Quest. When they ask me what my favorite game is, I say Beneath the Steel Sky. That's how it works.
It's a very, very good game.
I love it to bits. So I was actually kind of knocking on the doors, and you probably don't recall this because you must have gotten a lot of people's attention back in 1994-5 or thereabouts. But I actually managed to have a little chat with Tony Warner and Dave Cummins at the time.
Oh, fantastic!
Yes, I was thrilled as well, and I'm very sad that we didn't have cloud storage for email back in that day, because all those emails have sadly been lost. So all my correspondence with Dave Cummins has just gone missing.
And that's especially sad, given that Dave, of course, is no longer with us, because you went looking for him a couple of years ago.
Oh yeah, that whole.
Yeah.
Yes, sadly he did that whole tangent, and which was a shame, because at the time I was knocking on his door, he was no longer with Revolution, but he was still interested in. I said I was going to make a Beneath the Steel Sky fan site, and he was actually going to actively help out in that. He was going to jot down his notes for Beneath the Steel Sky 2, and he was going to send me the original score that he composed for Beneath the Steel Sky on, I think it was an Atari or something. Anyway, long story short. Where the hell was I going with all of this? Yes, I was knocking on your doors, and I remember Tony Warner and Dave Cummins, and even you, I believe, at the time, saying that the reason why you didn't do much with virtual theater after Lure of the Temptress was that Beneath the Steel Sky was, if you'll pardon the phrase, a completely miserable experience developing. Long hours, hugely ambitious project. No one was happy until that thing was released, and then. After
that's
that,
true. That's true. And it's always the way. It's always the way. And I really, nowadays, you have middleware, which makes such a difference.
Yes.
Middleware, Unreal Engine is what Unreal Engine is brilliant. Unity is absolutely brilliant. It's empowering people to write games, whether they be simple, whether they be complex. It's just changed everything. But in those days, you had to write everything yourself, and it just was and it got out of control. Our games were always bigger than we expected, always under budgeted. It was miserable.
I recall.
But then at the end of it, the game comes out and everybody loves it, and you forget it. So I would hope that the people saying it's miserable were probably saying it quite close, because when you look back 10 years later, it was a great experience.
Well, it was a learning. I think we were talking about favorite movies and stuff, and I seem to oddly gravitate towards pieces of fiction, pieces of art that were miserable during development. I mean, my favorite movie of all time is Blade Runner, and movies like RoboCop and movies like Alien, even, where no one was having any fun whatsoever.
I don't think it's a coincidence, because I mean, lots of the best creative decisions are usually taken as a result of heated arguments. I mean, even
under pressure.
Exactly.
The most terrifying thing would be to say, here's an infinite. In fact, a publisher once did this, and I can't tell you who, but they basically said, look, we've got lots of money. Will you write us a game? And I said, yes. What kind of game? You decide. What's the budget? We've got all the money, we've got as much money as you want. And it was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. And we screwed it up. I mean, basically, a blank piece of paper without any constraints is a very difficult thing to try and come up with something creative.
It is terrifying, and given a big bag of cash, you just sit there with, I can imagine, a very, very severe case of imposter syndrome. Can I actually do this?
I remember a quote from Liam Howlett, of all people, the dude behind The Prodigy, the band, saying,
well, that's a bit of a jump, but I'll let it slide.
No, it'll make sense. Well, he said that after they did their massive album, Fat of the Land, and he had all the money in the world, and he had all the studio equipment that he could ever need, and then he just sat in that room for days and weeks on end, just staring at it all, going, I have too many goddamn options. Yeah. I don't even know where to start right now. So at the end of it, he just sold all his equipment and did the next Prodigy album on a laptop, just using Propellerhead's Reason, because he needed constraints in order to work efficiently.
I mean, there are favorite stories like this in all kinds of art. I mean, Trent Reznor is another great example in music. You've got stuff like The Fragile, which has a similar story. Well, he didn't throw out all of his gear, but it makes sense to me that you would have this kind of stuff going on in the game world as well, because it is a terrifying prospect.
Oh yeah. Speaking of like middleware, stuff like Adventure Game Studio, which is brilliant for people like me who couldn't write a single line of code to save his life. I can actually get in and create an adventure game with that very simple scripting system. And I have had this power between my fingers for so long. I mean, the Adventure Game Studio goes back many, many years, many iterations, all the way back to DOS, for God's sake.
Late 90s or something.
Yeah, and I haven't done a thing with it until Adventure Jam shows up. What was called Point and Click Jam. It's a game jam that started about 4 years ago, and it gives you 2 weeks to produce an adventure game. And in the time that I have had access to Adventure Game Studio, I have produced exactly 4 games.
Wow.
Which were all created in the span of 2 weeks each year for Adventure Jam. So, constraints help out, whether they be self-imposed or not. And I assume in the case of Beneath the Steel Sky, just to try and steer this back on track, it was a case of, I suppose, ambition and underfunding is what I'm
and also that sort of driving will, because the thing is that the whole team was really ambitious, and it's and I drive this not wanting to let go. It should be better. There are things that we can do that are better within the time constraints, within the budget. We need to get it right, and everybody's very proud. It's an amazing. I mean, we're very privileged to be pioneers in this extraordinary industry. And when you work with ambitious, talented people, everybody's there for a shared vision to just make it as good as it possibly can be, even if it's a miserable experience because of that.
I think we would want to. We seem to need to get to the present time. Need is a loose term, but I would like to hear a little bit about Broken Sword now that we've talked about Beneath the Steel Sky, because clearly you kept some Indiana Jones influence from the old days.
Yeah. So with Broken Sword, but Beneath the Steel Sky, Lure of the Temptress and Beneath the Steel Sky had done well. Obviously, we'd worked with Dave Gibbons on Beneath the Steel Sky, and that was really fun. He's a top guy. And we were approached by Sean again, who had moved to Virgin, and he said, look, we want your games to compete directly with LucasArts and Sierra. And for that, you need to be more ambitious. You need bigger production values, and offered to fund a much more ambitious game. Mm-hmm. And so I went out looking for good people. Steve Oates was fantastic as an animator, and the resolution was much greater, but he was able to handle that. We drew some backgrounds, and they weren't very good. But I had read in Edge that there was a college in Dublin called Ballyfermot, and it had been set up to feed the Don Bluth Studios based in Dublin with animators and layout artists. And I'd read that they were very, very good. And I went over there to look for some animators, and I met a gentleman called Owen Cahill, who was the head of layout. And he took a look at the layouts that we'd done, and he looked me in the eye and he said, "These are not good enough. I'm going to show you what I do." And he did, and they were so beautiful, so beautiful. And he said, "You need to employ me." And he was right. And
that is the best job interview I've ever heard, the best job interview story. Just someone looking you straight in the eye going, "Your shit's not good enough. You should hire me."
I know. It was such an arrogant thing to say, but it so worked because he was so brilliant. And so a lot of the layout, a lot of the look that Broken Sword brought came from him. Obviously, we then teamed up with Barrington Phelan on the music front.
Yes.
By chance, Barrington was somebody I happened to play cricket with 5 years beforehand, when he just arrived in England and nobody knew him. So I mean, the serendipity of these things is quite extraordinary. Quite extraordinary.
I mean, that should be the title of your autobiography: is the stars aligned, or Serendipity, a story by Charles Cecil. It's just it's amazing. It's nice to hear good fortune, just happening by happenstance.
Yeah. Well, can I give you another example, which is much more recent? But when writing Broken Sword, the granddaddy of all of those books about the Templars is a book called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, yes, by Henry Bainient and I can't remember the other one, Michael Bainient and Henry Lincoln. And it is a load of old nonsense. It's utter cobblers, the idea that there's something called the Priory of Sion. Now, when Dan Brown wrote the Da Vinci Code, he writes, in fact, there is an organization called the Priory of Sion. Well, Dan, you're talking a load of old nonsense, because the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail was a whole load of old nonsense. I didn't put any of this into Broken Sword 1 because it was clearly not true. So anyway, on that basis, I know we're going fast forwarding a lot of time, but I've been approached by Take-Two to get involved with the Da Vinci Code, the game. But that's a different story. But anyway, my wife and I were seeing a friend of mine from school in the Dordogne, and I was canoeing down the Dordogne with him, and she was sort of waiting to meet us. And she was in a beautiful village called Carignac. And she got bored. She'd had a coffee. She went into, and this is a population of maybe 200 people. She was with it's a tiny little village. And there was a little art gallery there. So she went into the art gallery to look around. And she saw a book with a Templar cross on the front. So she picked it up. And the gallery owner happened to be there. And he walked over and asked her why she was interested in the book, in French. She speaks no French. And he spoke no English. So anyway, they communicated, and she told him about revolution and what I was doing. It turned out that he was a guy called Jean-Luc Chamois, who had interviewed Pierre Plantard, the guy who claimed to be the Grand Master of the Priory of Sion. He'd interviewed him in the 70s. So we came across the world's most eminent expert on the Priory of Sion in this tiny little bookshop in the front. And I had no connection with that. I was there because I was meeting a friend from school. We had so the probability of that happening is so tiny.
That is so very, very, very slim.
That I just have this sense that you grab your opportunities, but I really do believe in serendipity. That there is more than just the pure probability. Of course, so many of these people say, "Oh, it's all probability." Well, no, it's not probability, because there are 60 million people in France, and on that, I've probably met a few thousand people. The chances of a few thousand people turning into that 1 in 60 million is very, very remote, particularly when you add all of these things up.
Unless, of course, the Priory of Sion has it all planned out for you.
Yes. So they do meet in Parisian sewers, but instead of speaking about world domination, they're just going, okay, what should we throw at this Mr. Cecil now? Yes.
Do you know, I hadn't even struck me. You're a genius. I think that must be what it is. And they wanted to put me off the trail. They were so fed up with Dan Brown, writing all this stuff about me.
Yeah. Well, most people would be fed up with Dan Brown writing about him, to be honest. It's entertainment, but it's little more than that. This is a pretty good idea for Broken Sword 7 or 8, isn't it? Where it turns into a meta game.
We are very big Space Quest fans, so every time a person in a computer game meets up with its creator and is then told to, pardon the expression, fuck off, which is what happens at the end of Space Quest 3, we just clap in our little hands and such. But no, please don't take that as a serious suggestion.
It wasn't.
So yes, Broken Sword. In case everyone who's listening to this has been living under a rock somewhere, this is probably what will eventually be enshrined on Mr. Cecil's tombstones. Here lies Charles Cecil. He made Broken Sword. Pay some respect. And it has indeed followed you up until present time. Now, the interesting thing about Broken Sword, the series, is that it lived through. Let's see. The first Broken Sword came out in 1995, or was it 96? 96. Yes. 6. So we are in the let's say tail end of the golden years of point-and-click adventure games, and at this point, 3D accelerators are out. The PC gaming world is starting to look more towards 3D accelerated games, and Broken Sword has to sort of catch up with that. Now, the second game in the series is very much like the first. It is a 2D, beautifully drawn, well-written, funny, and engaging point-and-click adventure game. And yes, I do love the Broken Sword series. Everyone who reads my Tumblr, shut up. And then after that, I would assume that someone either looks you straight in the eye, as people apparently want to do, or you hear somewhere through the grapevine that we are now no longer interested in your beautiful 2D hand-drawn art. No, sir. You must get with the times. Now, how was that experience, and what led to the crate-shoving wonder that is Broken Sword 3?
Okay, basically, Broken Sword 1 had been very successful, and the PlayStation had just come out, and the PlayStation, which is, fantastic, but in many ways was responsible for the demise of the adventure. And the reason is because publishers decided that everything had to be 3D and visceral. Yes. And so they produced vast numbers of very similar games, basically killing off the indie scene.
Yes, I recall AdventureSoft in Britain were told while they were doing Simon the Sorcerer 3, very also beautifully hand-drawn 2D art, and they were told no publisher will even look at your game unless it uses 3D. Unless
Absolutely. So when Broken Sword 1, I remember talking to Virgin and saying that we'd like to publish this on PlayStation. And they said, you're mad. It's never going to work. So we went to Sony, and Sony weren't very excited. But the game, we were able to publish directly with Sony, and they sold 500,000 copies. I mean, it was just massive. It was huge. Got fantastic reviews. I remember the official PlayStation magazine in France, UK, and the UK one had a circulation of 600,000, which is unthinkable now. The German one was huge, French one. Each gave it 9 out of 10. Great reviews, did really, really well.
Well, it is a good game.
Well, that's very kind. But on PlayStation, it was a pain to play. I mean, it took so long. But it got great reviews. People loved it. It was a different era. So then we wrote. Then Virgin said, well, actually, we don't want to commission Broken Sword 2. Why is that? Because the adventure's dying. But this one made you so much money. It made you so much money. And in the end, Sean came and supported us, and a very talented guy called Martin Spies. And in the end, they decided to commission it. That did even better. And on PlayStation, and they again decided they didn't want to publish it, it sold 600,000. And when the official PlayStation magazine ran a reader's poll, Broken Sword 2 was the 6th most popular game, and Broken Sword 1 was like number 10. We were beating massive games. Wow. But the publishers were still looking and saying, we don't want to publish adventures.
That's ridiculous.
Despite the fact that, one, commercially they were really successful, and two, you had these polls where these games were being voted by on a 3D console by people who wanted 2D games.
Mm-hmm. That is so ridiculous.
It is so ridiculous. But those very same publishers were saying, the PC's dead.
Right. Guitar groups are on their way out, Mr. Epstein.
Well, exactly. But I'll tell you what, the head of Virgin, in the US, a guy called Martin Alper, invited me for lunch. And he seriously told me that the reason he made such good decisions on which video games to commission is because he'd never played a video game in his life.
Mm-hmm. Now, you would assume that there are a lot of marketing divisions out there, and I would know, let's say for half a fact, I mean it is anecdotal, but I'm pretty sure that the marketing department at Sierra Online, at least in the mid-90s, were of let's say, similar persuasions, as in they didn't actually play games. They just got the Cliff's notes from not even the designer, probably like the head of production or something. He just said, this is a game about space travel. And they just made up a slogan and shoved it on the box.
Yep, that's the one. So, yeah, anyway, what I'm not quite sure how we got down here. I've forgotten. I've gone off on a tangent.
Broken Sword 1 and 2, absolutely massively successful.
Yes,
and
very,
then
very successful. And then Virgin, who was our publisher, collapsed. But they would never have published Broken Sword 3 anyway, because it would have had to be 3D. And the real problem is that poor old Jane Jensen, when she did Gabriel Knight 3, clearly it was a disaster from a 3D perspective, from a visual perspective. Not from a gameplay perspective, but from a visual perspective.
It's the one Gabriel Knight game I have never played, and I love the first one. I love the second one. The third I cannot get into because it's basically choose your own camera angle.
Okay. Let's just briefly. I happen to know a little bit about the development of Gabriel Knight 3, and it is one of those, oh my god, everyone was so miserable. It was something like borrowed technology. No one had a manual. They couldn't redraw models, 3D models, once they'd actually been compiled, because that would just break the entire thing. So everyone looked like stumpy little triangular people and such, which is no excuse, of course. Nascent technology and all that. But it is famously one of the let's try and make a 3D adventure game. I thought it was a novel idea that you don't control the main character, you control the camera, but people weren't really on board with that. And to top it off, as you say, Mr. Cecil, it looked atrocious.
Yeah, well, that's no reflection on the designers. It was just everybody said it had to go to 3D. And unfortunately, she went very early. And, the 3D cards just went up to it. And the whole point about an adventure game is it's all about the empathy, it's about the beauty of the characters in the environment. And at that point, 3D was absolutely, was way, way, way behind in terms of, visual quality, what you could achieve in 2D.
Yes.
So the retail, the shops had become full of these visceral 3D games that the publishers had decided were the only ones that would sell. And there was no space for adventure games. And we then pitched THQ, we pitched Broken Sword 3 for THQ as a 3D game, which it had to be. And a lot of people still to this day say they really enjoy it. I think you're probably going to disagree with me, but I think visually it looked nice. It had its own style. Now clearly the box pushing was bloody stupid, but
well, you're not the only ones to fall culprit to, you're not the only ones to fall for that design mechanic, design trap. And
then Broken Sword 4 came, Broken Sword 3 earned $16 million at retail, and THQ got $10 million, of which they paid us $2 million, which is, because the dollar collapsed, was £200,000 less than it actually cost us. So we had to borrow £200,000. The game almost recouped, but didn't. And, you can have a little laugh. We have a little laugh now, because if you put, if it's $10 million, you can hold your fingers up. $2 million went to us. $1 million probably went on cost of goods. Maybe $1 million went on everything else, but it's very hard to think. So, and then let's take another $1 million off just because of creative accounting.
Embezzlement.
Well, THQ made at least $5 million, and we made over £200,000 loss, which it took us 8 years to pay off.
Wow.
Jesus. Ouch. And I will be fair that Broken Sword 3 did look great. I did play it on the PlayStation 2. The only reason I didn't finish it was the disc was corrupt. That's a pretty big whoopsie, and there was one stealth section I couldn't complete, but that's because I'm terrible at stealth sections. So
that was a mistake. It was a mistake. I'm sorry about that. The stealth, and I know exactly what you're talking about, and we just didn't put enough clues into the player to understand when they could be seen and when they couldn't. So I apologize personally for that.
I've never played the third one, only the two first ones, but does it by chance involve any goats?
Each one has a goat. Each broken sword has got a goat in it, in some capacity or other.
I haven't made it to the goat in the second one then.
Oh, it is. It is there.
Oh,
It
okay.
is in. It is in the. It is in the. Oh, it's not Syria. It's shit. That Mexican village. It's not Mexican.
That's
sorry.
Troels, that's a bit risque.
Corrimonte.
Oh,
Yeah,
right.
Corrimonte. Exactly. Yes, with the corrupt police officer and brilliant stuff. There's a goat there.
But now that we're
sorry.
talking about Broken Sword and
Yes.
specifically talking about the money that you made from it or didn't make, I suppose we could talk a bit about, just skipping a bit ahead, but we're a bit into that, talking about the Kickstarter that you did for Broken Sword 5.
Notice how we just skipped past Broken Sword 4.
I didn't do it deliberately, but I do think it's something we've been talking a lot about with people on the show, the supposed Kickstarter bubble, because there was kind of this golden age of Kickstarter, golden age of crowdfunding in 2012-ish, where all of these adventure game designers, be they indies or veterans, came out of the woodwork with new game ideas. In the cases of some, completely new intellectual property. In the case of others, such as yourself, sequels to existing games. And you wanted to do another Broken Sword. So has this... How has this experience been? Has it been a positive experience to have your project funded in that way, or has it? Have you noticed some challenges about it that you hadn't thought of when you ventured into it?
Well, one of the most extraordinary things was to build a direct relationship with what's now called community, because when back in the ZX81 days, we'd meet people, as I said, and talk to them directly, and then publishers got them, started publishing, and then retailers, and then publishers. So we had, so we lost our direct relationship with our audience very quickly. What I remember so well is when we decided to publish Beneath the Steel Sky on iOS, we did a little launch, and all these people came along. And it was really gratifying. And then we did Broken Sword, and the room was full of people. We'd gone to Apple, and they had invited us to use the store, the Apple store in Regent Street. And people queued for signed comics, and they talked about what they loved, and people told us their stories and their anecdotes, and it was absolutely wonderful. And Kickstarter was an extension of that, because we had 15,000 backers, and they were very vocal. They told us what they liked, and they told us what they didn't like. But the great thing about the adventure community is that they're a really good community. They wanted to like our game. So what I said to the team was, if we screw this up, it's our fault. We have these people, we have this goodwill. If we lose this goodwill, it's our fault. And broadly, I think we did a pretty good job. We communicated, we were honest, because the big thing about crowdfunding is that it changes the emotional relationship. Because before we launched it, it was, we're so looking forward to Revolution's game. But for people who supported it, it was our game. We are in it. We're all in it together. So it became quite clear that people wanted to be part of the good and the bad. They wanted to know what was going well, what was going badly. Mm-hmm. And it's obvious if you then lie to people and pull the wool over their eyes, they feel very cross and very angry. And some of the other developers fell foul of that. We didn't. I mean, clearly you can't give too much away because you ruin the story. But broadly, we tried to stay as honest as we could within the context. And a lot of fans came back and said it's the best Kickstarter they've ever done. When can we help, or how can we participate in your next one? It was great. I mean, it took a lot of time. That's the only thing. It took a lot of time because people, quite reasonably, are very demanding. If people put a couple of $100 in, then they expect to be communicated with. They expect updates every month, and that's quite reasonable.
Did you consider how that? I mean, it must have impacted you as a company. When exactly did you sit down and factor in this level of communication, which was obviously way bigger than back in the day when a publisher would hand you basically a check and a blank paper and say, this is what I want, absolutely nothing, now go do it,
well, except the publishers didn't. What publishers did is they asked you to design the thing in advance, and then they resisted you changing it, which is a ridiculous way of writing. Because how can you possibly write the story and the design in advance? Because you've got to iterate. You've got to. I mean, it's obviously what agile is. The agile methodology. It's all about, instead of saying that the specification is fixed, you say the budget is fixed and the time is fixed. So therefore, the variable and the quality is non-negotiable. So therefore, the variable is the scope, and you vary the scope depending on where you stand. I mean, that would have been impossible when we had publishers, because
in my experience, very few, shall we say, big cheeses are that they kind of misinterpret what agile development is and what iterative development is to suit their own needs, which is selling your game as fast as possible, I suppose, in this context.
I think it's right to interpret agile in a way that best suits the studio and the team. But to us, it's a case of when the going gets tough, it's like, is this a need to have or is this a want to have? Mm-hmm. And if it's a want to have and we can't afford it and it can go, then it needs to go. And that means that you define on an ongoing basis what is essential and what is not essential. And if you have the luxury of adding it in, then great. And if not, then it goes by the wayside.
Right. A question back to the Kickstarter thing is, one of the things that became very apparent when, for instance, my heroes, the two guys from Andromeda, came out in 2012, as did everybody else apparently, and said, we're going to make a spiritual successor to Space Quest, and I was very involved in that process. I was community manager on the on the Kickstarter thing, and actually got to talk to them. Oh my God! And now I'm talking to you, which is similarly fantastic. But one of the things that really was a wake-up call to me, and let's just be perfectly honest, to a lot of backers on Space Venture in particular, which is now, 20 millennia overdue or something?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, it is a very late game, and it's not even out. It's supposed to come out this year. People seem to have rather unwillingly become more aware of just how much effort goes into developing a game. I mean, you have those really cross, sort of very entitled people in the Kickstarter comments who
pledged $10, and it was never going to be good enough. I mean, I'll go on record saying that I put about the equivalent of about $150 into it, and I'm perfectly fine with it being delayed, because I pledged to these artists who may not have the best grip on project management, and that's fine. But there was always, I believe one of the dangers of crowdfunding is you'll always get a subset of backers who will never be satisfied. Otherwise, I do agree with you, Charles. It is a very nice community.
Well, I guess what I was getting at was that greater awareness of what it takes to build a game, because you can't make a game for $500,000, which is what the Space Venture raised. I guess my question is, I mean, feel free to just answer what Fred said and ignore me, but I think what I wanted to hear was, did your backers have that same awareness, being so closely involved in your creative process? Did they see just how much effort actually goes into development of a game?
Well, we were lucky. We were quite early. We had a very forgiving audience. When we announced it, which was August 2012, I was foolish enough to say that the game would be out in April 2013. And at the same time, one of our stretch goals was adding an extra level, an extra section, which kind of was stupid, because by adding an extra section, it meant that we had to rework the design. Now, I think it was better for it, but the idea that you can add an extra section and then get it out within 9 months or within 6 months was stupid. And we had this incredible positivity. And I remember April was coming along and a few backers said, "Oh gosh, it must be nearly ready. How are you doing?" And I remember one weekend I braced myself. I wrote the reply to say, "Look, it's going to be out later this year. I'm really sorry." And I expected a big response. And there was a big response. Half the people said, "Well, we didn't believe you anyway. So, we always thought it was going to be the end of 2013. And the other half said, "Well, we've been waiting for 5 years. Just take your time. We're really going to look forward to getting it when it arrives." And it was such a generous response, and not one person complained.
Wow.
However,
that is a far cry from what's happening over at the Space Venture Kickstarter.
It's a very, very hard concept to grasp for a Dane, no one complaining.
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
We really do have. I mean, I also have to say that a large proportion of our audience are women, and perhaps women just have a different view. I don't know. Anyway, so then, then several things happened. It became, by the end of 2013, it was clear that we were not going to finish it, and the mood was beginning to change. Peter Molyneux was beginning to lose, his community was beginning to turn against him.
Yeah, that wasn't a nice story.
That wasn't a nice story at all. No. But then also, Clank had collapsed. Do you remember Clank?
No, that doesn't ring a bell. I'm sorry.
Me neither, I'm afraid.
Clank was Niall Stevenson.
Still not ringing any bells, I'm afraid. Isn't it an adventure game? Because if not...
No. But it was. He's a writer. He's a well-known writer.
Oh, no. I've heard the title, but that's about it.
Yeah, and basically he raised however many hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then he decided to discontinue the project. And in his message, he blamed the industry. He blamed the fact there wasn't enough money.
This is the guy who had a complete meltdown, isn't it? Or was that more of a webcomic thing?
No. He didn't have a meltdown at all. He basically he blamed everybody except himself, and he showed not one degree of humility. And I was just absolutely shocked because he'd taken all this money from people who'd given it to him in good faith.
Yeah.
And I didn't show any remorse or any humility, and I was really surprised. And there was an anger building. There was an anger amongst the community, which is one of the reasons why we split the game, because I didn't have the confidence to go back to our community and say, "Look, guys, I told you that we delayed it, but we're going to delay it again." So we split the game because I couldn't. I was just too scared of what the community might do if we were to delay it again.
Yeah, torches and pitchforks and...
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting... I mean, again, we're talking about the state of the industry. At this point, you're in direct communication with your target audience. You're not going through a publisher, or you're speaking to a journalist from a PC game and addressing the issues. You're now communicating directly with your audience, and I can understand the intimidation that must be part of that process, especially when you've got bad news to share.
It's terrifying. And I mean, the other thing is that Peter had ignored his community, and now, but by the end of 2013, as this is what we're talking now, Peter hadn't had this tsunami of press and a tsunami of anger from backers, but the writing was on the wall. It seemed clear that people were beginning to fall out of love, and you went out and raised money at your peril, or let your backers down at your peril.
Yeah. Well, I must commend you for your nobility in trying to stay as transparent as possible, which is, believe it or not, in my day job, I'm actually a social media and crowdfunding consultant, which sounds fantastically fancy, but is nothing of the sort. But I have been at panels trying to convince, because what you have to realize about Denmark is that we're about 5 or 10 years behind everyone else in the world. So the concept
except that your developers produced Inside and Limbo.
Well, yeah,
and Unity.
Yes, Unity. Yeah. So I'm sorry. I'm going to have to defend you. I think Denmark's an extraordinary. I think you've got an extraordinary development community there.
We've always had a very healthy underground, and the dudes who invented Unity were also just underground hackers having a laugh, really, and it just grew into this magnificent thing. But to the I hate to use the term layperson, but I'm going to because second language. They just don't know what the hell crowdfunding is, and this was what 2015 or 16, and I was still giving lectures on crowdfunding. Is when you announce your project, then ask people to give you money. What, like a bar tip? No. So
I actually want to move on a bit, because we are nearly coming up on the proverbial end times of this episode, and we have a question.
So glad you got the episode in that sentence.
I don't like to lead people on. I don't know.
The meteor
much
is hitting the ground anytime soon.
I don't know much in the way of
I
don't know much in the way of biblical apocalyptic prophecies, but we do actually have a question from the academic gentleman whose shoes and other articles of clothing you have proven very, very worthy to fill, indeed, Charles.
Yes, round of applause on that one.
We've got a question from Gareth, who brings up the point that there are a lot of more experienced developers now, obviously, in the games industry, unlike 40 years ago when you started. And
when you had to depend on a publisher because you can self-publish now.
Exactly. You can also do that, and you can even take an education on game design. There are college grads out there majoring in this. Would you say that this has raised the quality of the computer games being developed now, or was there something, air quotes, better about the early days?
I feel very passionately that your best results come from the energy and the new ideas that young people bring, and the expertise and the ability not to make the same mistakes that experienced people have. So my team is, in the design, is generally people who are very young. I find the people that we have in our team are incredibly open to new ideas. They don't think they know it all, but they are, they bring a new dimension. I know that it's oversaid, but diversity, I really do think, is important because it brings a range of ideas that perhaps a white Christian man, English man, might not have. And would not have, but and also the world is so different now. But I hope that you will see with our new games that actually this mix between new young ideas coming from young people and the experience that I and a number of the a small number of other people who've been around for as long as I have. Hopefully we will mold something that feels fresh and new and different. And it'll be different because it's got the diversity of younger people and older people working together. But no, I don't think it would be right to say it's better now or better then. I mean, clearly it's a lot easier now. And there's a lot of crap because it's so easy to publish. In fact, there's no barrier to entry whatsoever.
True.
But overall, games. I mean, one of the joys that I've seen is that, when companies like THQ ruled the roost, you'd have a few AAA games that were, really very good, but you'd have an awful lot of mediocre games, and there was no scope whatsoever for indie games. With digital distribution and the barrier to entry disappearing, you still have your AAA games. You have a vast number of indie games, and you really have nothing in between, which is why THQ went bankrupt within 3 or 4 years of this revolution.
Interesting pun there.
Unintended.
Yes.
We would have played back the CSI Miami intro had Gareth been here to do it, but
yes, I must say, just on a personal note, that I commend your continued passion for having lived through what I would describe as the dark ages of adventure games, and then come out on top and be comfortable in the role of adventure games as not what some people look back on as the AAA titles of the 90s, or at least the early 90s, and be comfortable in the role of an indie developer, and still have that passion to tell good stories and make the sort of games that we all enjoy playing, at least.
It is very inspirational, to be honest.
Yes.
And I think it's a good thing to take away from this episode. There is hope out there.
if someone can retain their enthusiasm and their optimism, and having developed games in the late 90s and early noughts, then that is indeed a stance to be commended.
Well, can I just say something that you might think is contentious? I mean, an adventure goes way beyond just point and click. Her story is an adventure, absolutely.
Yes.
And Life is Strange is an adventure, absolutely. The adventure now is much wider as a genre, and still very, very successful. It doesn't need to be limited just to point and click.
Oh no,
Dreamfall is an excellent adventure.
Oh yeah,
yes.
Gone Home.
We agree completely. One of the things we've been talking about, one of our philosophies on the show, is actually that we consider storytelling in games, narrative storytelling in games. Well, that's a stupid way of saying it.
This is where I usually quote Aristotle.
Yeah,
beginning, middle, and end.
We see interactive storytelling as a natural progression of storytelling in general, like from campfire stories to printed press to movies to interactive storytelling.
Putting the player in the role of someone who has active influence in the story. It's quite a natural evolution when you think about it, because the campfire stories that Troels mentioned would also usually evolve, given the audience reaction. You might encourage your audience to become more frightened because you enjoy seeing that, so you make up a couple of more scary moments to go along with it. It's quite natural that you would up the bar of interactivity.
Yes. We quite enjoy this. So we are very much on board with the idea that it's not just adventure games. It is, in fact, it's a storytelling medium in and of itself. It's not emulating a written novel. It's not emulating a movie. Interactive movies is a passé description. It is, in fact, a storytelling medium in and of itself.
A narrative medium, basically.
Yes.
Games focusing on narrative. That's what we're all about.
Brilliant.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
I also do enjoy the way you say "brilliant." I can imagine that the Revolution offices would be very, very cheerful.
They are cheerful, but that's because I really love the team that we've got. I really enjoy working with them, and I think they enjoy working with me. I think.
Well, I just have to get this in there. I have one thing I want to add here at the end, but first let me just say that I've listened back to the soundbite of the Adventure X from 2 years ago when I asked that question in the auditorium, and it just started out as is it Cecil or Cecil? It is Cecil, isn't it? And he just went, yes, very good. And it just a cheer to my heart. So I imagine if you carry on that tone with your team, like that, sort of a jovial we're all in this together, lads.
Hopefully none of them ask how your name is pronounced.
We've covered that. The last thing we have to get in before we sadly have to end the episode. My God, we have monopolized your time for a bit over that hour we promised. I'm sorry.
Well, it's been great speaking to you.
Oh, thank you. Likewise. One of my dear friends, in real life as it happens, is a man named Björn. However, he goes by the auspicious nickname Torpedo Bear. And we can all have a laugh at that. He actually sent a voicemail to us that we wanted to play for you. But since we are absolute technical Luddites, our friend Gareth is usually the one who takes care of all the interesting technical bits. We are unable to actually play it for you. We will, however, cut it in the final episode. But I'll have to read out a transcript of that voicemail for you. It is very short. But he would be not only delighted, but might possibly suffer some sort of cardiac episode if you would address his question.
Fantastic. Sorry, remind me of his name.
His name is Björn, as in.
So Torpedo Bear, you say?
Yes, Torpedo Bear.
Great.
Exactly.
Hello, Troels! My name is Torpedo Bear. Lady Piermont is one of my favorite characters of all time because she is quintessentially British. And she has invaded both time and space since she is in both Beneath the Steel Sky and in the Broken Sword series. So here's my question. Will Lady Piermont be appearing in both Beneath the Steel Sky 2 and in Broken Sword 6? Or is she now exclusively a Broken Sword character? Thank you.
She's Danielle Piermont, isn't she? She's Danielle Piermont in Beneath the Steel Sky. I think that she is such a central character in Beneath the Steel Sky that when Beneath the Steel Sky 2 comes, she will have to make an appearance.
Oh,
however,
when he said when.
Yes, he did.
However, when we do a new Broken Sword, I think she's appeared twice. She's appeared in 5 and 1, so I doubt that she'd appear. So I would hold your breath for Beneath the Steel Sky 2 over Broken Sword 6 if I was you.
Mm-hmm. And you quite what's the word I'm looking for? Quite cleverly. I'm sorry, I can't think of a better word. But you quite cleverly saw what he was fishing after, and reeled him in, but not quite enough to get him on the boat. That is expertly done, sir. Well done.
Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, he is a torpedo bear, so by getting him on the boat, you may find yourself in a whole host of issues.
Oh yeah.
And we want to know why he calls himself Torpedo Bear.
He just loves the word torpedo, and it's the fact that the name Björn, his real name, is also the Danish name for bear.
That is
correct. The Danish word for bear. So basically, he's just the torpedo bear. He's a very speedy guy. Let's get this right back where it needs to be. Mr. Cecil, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you. It has been, dare I say, enchanting.
Oh, bless you. Well, it's been lovely speaking to you. Thank you.
So can I thank you enough? If you have some way that, if people out there want to get in touch with you or something they should look forward to or anything you want to add here, at the tail end, please feel free to do so now.
Well, if people want to, probably Twitter, because I'm pretty useless at checking, but I do check about once a week. Other people do it all the time, and it's lovely to hear. And I will come back to you, I promise you.
Yes. And on a personal note, thank you for enduring my barrage of emails back in the 90s. And that little incident about the stretch goal for Broken Sword.
No, it was a big mistake. And do you know what? If somebody feels passionately about something, then that's great, because even if they get very angry, because they have a passion, and it was naive. And when you and a few people ranted and said that it was a silly thing to do, we realized that it was a silly thing to do. It was a mistake. So thank you for letting us know that.
Now, thank you, Surf, because what I then found out was that having then gotten in contact with you, not only did you, assuage my fears that this was some sort of cynical ploy, you even solicited my advice, seeing that I was like an abysmally passionate person about Beneath the Steel Sky. You then solicited advice for, what did you like about the first Beneath the Steel Sky? What should we focus on next? And I was absolutely flabbergasted. And from that point on, I have had nothing but the deepest, darkest respect for you.
Well, that's very kind. The other thing that I would say about Dave Cummins is I have a very high respect for him. He was a huge asset to Revolution. Just for the record, he chose to leave Revolution when we started writing a game called In Cold Blood, and he came to me and he said, I hate these games. And when we then went back to writing adventures, I would have loved to have found him, but I think he had passed away at that point. So, yeah, he was troubled in many, many ways, but his talent outweighed all the trouble that he gave us. So he is missed. And while I know that he often didn't say, the nicest things about his time at Revolution, I would not say the same in reverse. He was terrific, and he is missed.
Yes. I miss him too, even though I only spoke with him briefly, and I share your view that yes, he was a very enthusiastic, passionate, and very, let's say, jovially cynical person.
Oh my god, he had a wicked sense of humor, but it was very dry, very cutting.
They're in the games for all to see.
He was very well read as well. He had a terrific grasp of language and was very knowledgeable. So, I mean, the fact that he ended up as a tester working for me at Activision kind of shows how his life was all over the place. It was a very haphazard life that he lived.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it is so gratifying to hear you speak so kindly of him. And
absolutely is. And as I was saying earlier, I believe I was close to cutting you off, Charles. Sorry about that. But as I was saying earlier, it's there in the games for all to see. I mean, his humor is all over the place, and it's very, very rare for me to pick up a game now from that time and get a genuinely good chuckle out of it. But I second Björn's sentiment in the voicemail completely, that Lady Piermont is so damn funny. There are so many brilliant puns and innuendos in there that I've never heard elsewhere, and it speaks volumes to the way that Dave wrote without knowing him.
Yeah.
Not to take away from your own brilliance, sir, because we all know that that the Broken Sword series, may have started as a teamwork, but you did carry on its legacy. And judging by the amount of fans that are still anxiously awaiting continuation after continuation of the series, must be testament to your talents as well, sir. So.
Oh well, no, that's very good. But Dave and I were very much, for the games that we wrote, we were very much a partnership. And as I said at the beginning, the games very much transpired, came or evolved from the fact that we had different approaches and this sort of slightly crazy mix of a serious narrative and ludicrous characters comes from how the two of us came together. But
which was actually a point that I somehow wanted to shoehorn into this episode, because that's one of the criticisms that Beneath the Steel Sky often gets. Why is this a dour cyberpunk adventure with humor in it? And I completely disagree with that approach to it. That is one of my that's the thing that I love about the game the most. So we are over an hour and a half in. I'm terribly sorry about that, but
well, it's been a pleasure. I shall sign off. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much.
It's been a great pleasure speaking to you both.
I hope to see you Adventure X next year, or
yes,
actually this
here.
year. This year, actually.
Indeed, I'll send an email off trying to get a sneak idea of when the date is, so I'll make sure it's reserved in my diary.
But It has been lovely to talk to you, Charles, and have a great evening, what remains of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Well, that was something, wasn't it?
That was something indeed. Yes, Charles Cecil has now disconnected from the call, so I am very confident to now go into the exit spiel. So I don't have to embarrass him by having to sit through
you
that.
don't want to do that in front of Charles Cecil. But he was actually great. That may have gone on a bit longer than usual, but he was a great storyteller. And
yes.
Again, that is also in the games for all to see. So take it away. People now know where they can find Charles Cecil. Where can they be inconvenienced with our internet appearances?
For the 2 or 1 or maybe no people at all who are still listening to this after Charles is disconnected, allow me
honey,
to
sorry about that.
Yeah, exactly. My wife doesn't even listen to the show. She couldn't give less of a fuck.
My girlfriend doesn't listen to this show either. But she doesn't do podcasts in general, so it's not personal, That's nice.
We can be found on the Twitters at BS Designers. Please send us a tweet. We all three of us respond. We sign the tweets, so you can expect you can expect a response to the same tweet from no less than 3 different people. It's exciting. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/backseatdesigners. We have a Patreon where you can actually fund our travels to go and meet Charles Cecil at Adventure X this year. Please go to patreon.com/backseatdesigners. We will bring back a photo.
But we cannot promise as positive communication or even much communication to begin with. We usually remember to upload the episode to Patreon.
We try. Sometimes one of us throws a hissy fit when the others won't do it, and that would be me, and I apologize for that. Wait, what? Maybe. Okay, never mind.
You shall never be forgiven.
No, I know. This is what happens when Gareth isn't here. He usually anchors us. What have we become?
Well, I mean, the other British person who anchored it signed off, so we're back to the good old days when it was just you, me, and an ailing telephone.
Yes, and we can shout at each other again, you silly bastard.
This is where I say it hasn't recorded at all.
Yes. Oh yeah, definitely. This basically it was the Aldo interview all over again. Hello, how's everyone? Beep. So, by the way, we also have a website, and that is where you can go to subscribe to the show via your podcast listening device of choice, and that is www.backseatdesigners.com. So, finally, let's say goodbye, Frederick.
Goodbye.
And say goodbye, Gareth.
Well, I don't know about you lot, but I think this has just been bangers and mash.
And it's
I'm not a professor.
Right. We'll see you next week.
No more for today.